I'm not saying this is what happened with the Cessna citation over Washington, D.C., but initial reports certainly sound familiar. On the morning of August 14, 2005, Athens Air Traffic Control informed the Greek military that there was a renegade aircraft circling their airspace. Helios Flight 522 had been scheduled to land, but had entered the Athens flight information region, made no radio calls, and did not respond to attempted contact from the ground. They just entered Athens airspace and began flying in circles, apparently on autopilot. At 11:05, two F-16s took off to make contact, and they successfully made visual contact, but that was all. They eventually reported movement in the cockpit, what appeared to be a person bending over the controls, but shortly after, the aircraft ran out of fuel. The engines gave out one after another, and the aircraft impacted a mountain, killing all 130 people on board. On this day, Flight 522 had experienced a layover in Larnaca. During this layover, the flight crew had reported to the maintenance ground crew that there was a frozen door seal making a lot of noise in the back. To fix it and test it, the maintenance crew had to do a pressurization check, which involves turning the onboard pressurization system from auto to manual. Because this is something that commonly happens during maintenance, and because it's particularly dangerous to fly the aircraft in this configuration, there are 3 different checks that are supposed to occur before this can become a problem. If the system is set to manual instead of auto, the cabin is not being pressurized during flight. This is where the next problem comes in. When the cabin isn't being pressurized during flight, an alarm goes off in the cockpit. Unfortunately, this particular alarm sounded identical to another alarm, which only applies on the ground, so if you hear that alarm in the air, you can just ignore it. The pilots heard the pressure alarm, assumed it was a ground alarm, and assumed nothing was wrong. These alarms only sound in the cockpit, so the only indication the passengers and cabin crew would have that something was wrong was when the oxygen masks dropped down, and there was no separate indicator in the cockpit to let the pilots know the masks had dropped down. Had any one person been aware of both of these things, the masks and the alarm, things probably would have turned out differently. The oxygen provided by these masks is not infinite. It's designed to provide enough oxygen for the pilot to get the aircraft below about 10,000 feet where the air is breathable. Because these systems have to sit around unused for long periods of time, they don't use bottled oxygen, they use a chemical reaction called an oxygen candle. The cabin crew, though, uses actual bottled oxygen because they're expected to move around the cabin during an emergency. This is what happened on board. Not long after takeoff, one of the pilots contacted Larnaca ground control and told them they were having a problem with the air conditioning. A member of the maintenance crew specifically asked them if the knob had been set to auto, but at this point the pilot was probably already suffering hypoxia and apparently never heard the question. So when the air masks dropped down, the cabin crew would have returned to their stations, gotten their own oxygen bottles, and would have put them on before moving about the cabin to check on the passengers. Then they would have just waited for the pilots to get the aircraft down. The pilots, not knowing what's going on, would never have started using supplemental oxygen. The rest is speculation. Allegedly, in the wreckage, there was a crew oxygen mask that contained DNA from a member of the cabin crew, the pilot, and the co-pilot. One of the members of the cabin crew was a licensed private pilot, the cabin crew had entry codes for the cockpit, and the cabin crew would have been conscious longer than anybody else. The pilots would have passed out first, then the passengers, and when that happened, the cabin crew probably would have gone to check on the pilot. By now, the pilots would have been unconscious for some time because they'd never started using oxygen. The F-16s did report movement in the cockpit, they did report someone bending over the controls, and it seems likely a member of the cabin crew was at least trying to use the radio to contact Athens Air Traffic Control, but they didn't have the training necessary to know how to switch to the right frequency. If this DNA evidence is accurate, it would seem to indicate that this crew member spent some time attempting to revive the pilots before the crash.